main so Professor Gerrans' main research interest is the use of psychological disorder to study the mind. He has written on autism and Williams syndrome, cognitive neuropsychiatry, moral psychopathologies such as psychopathy, and the emotions, as well as a monograph and associated series of papers on delusion and disorders of rationality. He's an associate of the Swiss Center for Affective Sciences, where he collaborates with philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists. Chris Litteby and him have just completed the project on philosophical issues raised by the nature of psychedelic experience. In all these cases, his focus is on the role of computational models, linking experience to neural processing. He has also just completed a manuscript on the relationship between emotional processing and self-representation, with an emphasis on psychiatric disorder, forthcoming with Oxford University Press. And if you're interested in his work, some recent papers include A Vessel Without a Pilot, Bodily and Affective Experience in the Cluttered Delusion of Inexistence in the journal Mind and Language, Alienation and Identification in Addiction, published in Philosophical Psychology, and Self-Unbound, Ego Dissolution in Psychedelic Experience in Neuroscience and Consciousness, written by with Chris Litteby. So, Professor Philip Gerrans, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Sarah and Anne-Marie for organising and for the invitation. It's very nice to be in Montreal again, even though only virtually. So thank you very much. I hope the talk is interesting to you all. I'll share my screen now and I'll just jump straight in. Is that okay for everyone? Good. All right, so the topic of the talk, as you can see, is pain, suffering, and the self. And of course, suffering is very interesting to everyone. We all do it to some degree and to some extent, but particularly psychiatrists, of course, deal with suffering in any and all of its forms. And pain and suffering, of course, are of great interest to philosophers because of their intimate connection with a lot of issues relating to self-awareness and filtering over into moral psychology and moral philosophy. But today I'm talking about the relationship between pain, suffering, and the self from the point of view of a philosopher who's interested in constructing what I would call integrative theories or integrative frameworks for understanding psychiatric disorder and using psychiatric disorder to shed light on life in general and these topics in general. So really I'm interested in trying to construct a framework or come up with a framework that would enable us to fit together all the evidence that could be relevant to linking the underlying neural mechanisms and neural processes to the cognitive architecture of the mind and the resultant phenomenology and experience which we manifest in everyday life, in which we're going about now. And pain is a very interesting topic here because raises all these issues. And one of the things that people always talk about is that pain, when you're in pain, it seems as though it's impossible that it could be someone else in pain. You know, pain is mind, pain is a kind of way of becoming intimately and automatically aware of yourself, but getting a handle on exactly what self-awareness is and the nature of that kind of self-awareness is very difficult. And so pain is a great topic to get started on that, precisely because even though we kind of automatically think that when we're in pain, it's our pain, it has these certain properties, it's distressing, it's aversively motivating, these things go together. There are some disorders in which these things kind of come apart. And when we can see pain without motivation or pain without distress, or even perhaps pain without self-awareness, it makes you wonder how they come together, so seem to be so fused in the normal experience, and what the underlying mechanisms are and how we might approach them. So that's why I'm interested in pain and suffering. Okay. Let me just start some pre-theoretical or kind of intuitive approach, and then I'll give you the outline of the talk. So I think like pre-theoretically or intuitively, everyone would think, well, yes, pain is produced by noxious stimulation, you know, bodily damage or its anticipation. Pain is aversively motivating. We try and get away from pain. it's negatively valenced, it feels unpleasant. And people also typically would say that its unpleasant character explains the aversion. We try and avoid distressing things. And of course, if you don't have that, then you'll be in a lot of difficulty. So someone with congenital insensitivity to pain is not averse. So for example, this person, I won't read the whole thing, but reports a long history of painless injuries, e.g. lacerations and fractures for which she didn't use analgesics. She reported numerous burns and cuts without pain, smelling her burning flesh before noticing any injuries. So, if you're not detecting damage and being averse to it, you are in a lot of trouble, and if you're not distressed by it. So just to push on a little bit on the intuitive or the basic idea, we think that pain is nociceptive. That's about detecting damage, transforming it into neural signals of damage and transmitting those signals onward so that we can take action. People also divide it into neuropathic pain, which is the inflammation or damage to the nerves themselves rather than their nociceptive afferents. In other words, the nerves which conduct the signal, they can become inflamed and they can give rise to pain, even perhaps if there is no actual damage at the surface or the periphery. And very interestingly, from our point of view today, there is what is called nociplastic pain. And this is a case where neural changes or adaptations in circuitry outside the nociceptive signaling pathway. Okay, and so just as a quotation, typically these are associated with altered neural activation in affective brain regions only. So this is the beginning of the thought that there's some aspect to the overall pain experience which comprises what we might call sensory and affect or emotional, if you want to put it like that. And in some cases, the affective part of the pathway or the affective part of the system or circuitry can become active in the absence or in the presence of only weak nociceptive signaling. Okay, and that is one of the thoughts about chronic pain. Often people with chronic pain do not have very strong nociceptive signaling. Okay, now here's the talk. I hope it's interesting. Interestingly, there are a lot of conditions in which pain and suffering come apart. Okay, and the classic case, which I'm going to talk about today, is pain asymbolia, in which people will say that they are in pain, often in severe pain, but they appear unbothered by it and they take no aversive action, which puts pressure on the kind of intuitive conception that pain, suffering, self-awareness, and so on all go together as a unity. Because often people with pain asymbolia will say it feels like it's someone else's pain. It feels like it's not happening to me. Okay, now there are two accounts of pain asymbolia. One is a deaffectualization account, which basically says, well, people with pain asymbolia, they have sensory damage and they're detecting sensory damage, but they don't have an affective or emotional response. That's one. And I'll point out some difficulties with that intuitively, if you like, satisfying explanation. Another one is a depersonalization account, which says that pain asymbolia is a species of depersonalization experience. And in depersonalization experience, as you would all know, people will report that they feel detached from or floating outside experience as though it's not really theirs, that as though these pains and experiences and so on and bodily changes and perceptions doesn't really feel like it's happening to them. So you can see the attraction of that account for pain asymbolia. And in fact, there's some overlap in reports of the conditions. Some people with depersonalization will say, yeah, I have pains, but they don't really affect me. I feel like they're not mine. So I think that there's a lot to be said for the depersonalization account. And that's what I'll be trying to provide a kind of a framework or underpinning for. But one problem with the depersonalization account, I think, is that, as stated, it gets the kind of neural underpinnings wrong. And there is a bit of a puzzle in trying to understand the neural underpinnings of pain asymbolia and depersonalization and how they fit together. And that is what I'll try and provide today. But I think it's of interest not just for pain asymbolia, because hopefully it's the bones of an account, a general account of the relationship between pain and suffering, and indeed of the nature of self-awareness in general. So let's go. So in pain asymbolia, philosophers have been very interested in this, or a subsection of the philosophical community, for obvious reasons. It's a remarkable situation in which the patient doesn't react to pain or in an incomplete and insufficient way. They might even inflict painful actions on themselves. Okay, so there's a classic statement. And vegetative reactions are preserved, such as a flinch. But other than that, you will find aversive actions not, they don't avoid it necessarily. And patients can understand the harmful nature of pain. Okay, but sensitivity is not altered in its elementary forms. Okay. Now there are many philosophers often talk about the classic cases from Stengel and Schilder in the 1920s. They seem to be repeated and repeated in the philosophical literature. So I thought I would give you a recent one from last year in Mexico. Mrs. AD, with no relevant medical history, presented during the night. She had what she described as the worst headache of her life. Her complaints are underestimated because of her mood. According to her family, she appeared in good spirits and unconcerned, although she still complained of a headache. She was in a euphoric mood, as well as with a childish, playful attitude. Throughout the pre- and post-intervention stages, it was confirmed that the patient reported pain, but didn't feel discomfort associated with the pain, despite initially rating the pain as the worst of her life. Okay, what was up with her? Well, what was up with her is that she had a stroke, basically. The only thing we need to take home from this is that it's in the insular cortex. And one important thing about pain asymbolia, can underline this, or we can park this idea, is that there's a consensus that pain asymbolia involves hypoactivity or damage to the posterior insular cortex. Okay, especially right, but the posterior insular cortex is important to remember. Okay. And so the interesting thing, just to repeat it, she didn't lack sensation, and people with pain asymbolia don't lack sensation, but they do feel like detached from it. It's not bothering them. Lack of aversive motivation and a lack of the usual distress or negative affect. And in her case, she was even positive or playful and lighthearted. Okay, which leads to what we can call the affective theory of pain asymbolia and pain processing in general, because the understanding of asymbolia is related to a general understanding of pain. And this is the idea that pain has a modular architecture. It has with a composite structure. And one module or one part of the system deals with nociceptive signals of damage or threat to bodily integrity, and a sort of initial aversive responses, the kind of automatic, so on. And that is mediated by the somatosensory cortex and, importantly, the posterior insula. I underline that again. And the affective aspect of pain depends on processing, if you like, at a higher or quite later level in an anterior insular cingulate circuitry. So the thought is basically you can pain, it's initially processed through the posterior insula along other pathways, but they come together in the posterior insula, and that leads to the kind of bodily sensations and helps to set up the bodily reactions and so on. But then the distressing part of pain is later, and if you like, higher order. That is more to do with the anterior insula. Okay. There's an old, I'll skip over this, but for those of you in Montreal who like to have it in your native language, there you go. This is an old thing which distinguishes between the sensation douloureuse, which is the sensational aspect of pain, and the affect secondaire, as they call it there. That's the distress. And the thought is that they can be separated or distinguished and independently damaged and independently activated. So, and the thought is, as you can see here, in pain asymbolia or asymbolia douleur, then what we have is damage to the posterior insula, as they should have said here. But then you have other disorders of affect, which are about the anterior insula. Okay. So here's a textbook affective account of pain. This is the basic of pain asymbolia. It appears to be a somatosensory limbic disconnection syndrome. Pain asymbolia can be conceptualized as a somatosensory analog of visual hypoemotionality. In other words, just as some people can see the world and go through the world getting all their perceptual sensations and have no emotional reaction to it, pain is a kind of spectacular case where people are having a kind of bodily sensory experience of pain or bodily damage, but no emotional reaction. That's why we call it the textbook affective account. And there are other reasons actually to be in favour of something like an affective account of asymbolia, or at least to think that pain might have an affective and a sensory component. And not these other reasons are, that some of them are, if you think about cases of empathy, if you observe someone else in pain and feel a kind of empathetic response or reaction, as we do, well, clearly our body is not being damaged, right? We're observing someone else's body or someone else in pain, but we feel a kind of instinctive, empathetic response. And in these cases, it's the anterior insular cortex, which is hypothesized to be the basis, right? So the thought is that when you're having an empathetic response to someone, it's the anterior insular cortex, which sets up this affective response. But when you're actually in pain yourself, it's the posterior insular cortex. And in a very famous case, Tanya Singer got people to observe their partner being mildly injured. It was a mild electric shock. And the women who were asked to observe their male partners having a mild painful experience, they experienced an empathetic response. But as she points out here, only part of the network mediating pain experience is shared when empathizing with pain in others. Empathizing elicits activity principally in the anterior insula, and as opposed to actually having the pain yourself, elicits activity in the posterior insula. So once again, very broadly, we have this kind of distinction between pain sensation mediated largely through processing in the posterior insula and affect through the anterior insula mediated by the anterior insula. Okay. And we can also look at other cases which are also very interesting. People with chronic pain or limagenesis or insensitivity to pain. In other words, people who are born with no limbs, or people who are born with the inability to sense pain through the nociceptive system, they still have empathetic responses, right? So someone who doesn't have that limb can still have an empathetic response when observing injury to someone else. So clearly it can't be coming through that circuitry that rehearses damage to the self, if you like. And similarly in chronic pain, as I noted at the beginning, people with chronic pain have more activity in the anterior insular singular cortex circuit, the so-called affective circuit, okay? And as they say, patients with chronic pain may have anatomical alterations within regions involved in cognitive and emotional modulation of pain, such as the ACC and insula. Okay, so overall, there's some good reason to think that affective response to pain that we see in empathy and so on rehearses a part of the pain circuit that's more to do with distress, more to do with emotional evaluation, more to do with kind of personal significance, versus a sensory part, which is more to do with detection of damage and processing of automatic bodily reactions. So you might think that this sharp distinction between affect and sensation is on good grounds, but we should also remember that if you take that hypothesis that there's like a sensory motor processing circuitry and affective circuitry, and you might infer that there's that this is a modularized system with different components, and indeed that is pretty much this story of Danziger's story, that the pain processing system divides up into all these little components with an affective and a sensory motor. So call that the modular story. But unfortunately, and for the modular story and as part of understanding pain in general, it can never be that clean. The dissociations are never quite that clean, and it's actually not the way the brain divides up into these neat little components, and patterns of activity are not routed through this componential processing system as smoothly and neatly and evenly divided as you might think. But just even phenomenologically, we can notice that against the affective theory, as people have noticed, people with frontal lobotomies, they have very flat affect, right? They have reduced affective responses, but their reactions to painful stimuli are increased or exaggerated, right? So no affect, but exaggerated aversive response. okay, which is the opposite of pain asymbolia. Pain asymbolia typically extinguishes the aversive response, okay? And also, we can also notice that in the Tanya Singer experiment, you know, she said that the empathic response to the partner was all about activation in the anterior insular and the cingulate circuitry, and which she distinguished from the posterior insular in the self pain condition. But in fact, the dissociation is not quite that clean. When people see severe wounds and so on, the sensory motor circuitry is also activated. And similarly, in some cases of phantom limb, you don't just have the affective, you have the sensory motor circuitry, okay? So the dissociation is never really that clean. It's not like a sensory component and an affective component, okay? So what this kind of tells us is that we can't really decompose pain into modular components with a discrete neural substrates that account for nociception, affect, motivation, okay? That dissociation is too clean, and there's no straightforward double dissociation here. So people have moved towards, in the pain processing, and I will be wrapping this up and making some philosophical points, I hope, towards the end, move towards like the matrix theory of pain, which comes from Ronald Melzak's work on phantom limbs. Okay, and what he suggested is that pain is not processed in a kind of series of discrete modules, but rather a large distributed matrix that spreads across the brain. And so in fact, what we have here is a kind of pattern of activity across a distributed matrix, you know, across a distributed set of neural circuits, okay? And what you feel in pain is the emergent result of activity across this distributed circuit. And the circuit can be, activity across the circuit can fall into different patterns that can be evoked and maintained, you know, from different starting points. So you're never going to get this kind of simple set of dissociations. What you get is different characteristic patterns of activity across the matrix. And the main point here is that different types of pain experience should be thought of as arising from different patterns of activity across a whole network, rather than as evidence of discrete modules within a pain processing system firing selectively. Okay. Now, there are many such diagrams of the pain matrix. It doesn't really matter too much, but just the thought is that there are a lot of distributed circuits interacting, reciprocally modulating each other, and so on. And what you experience in a pain experience is the emergent result, a pattern of activity across the distributed circuit. Okay. Now, we could say, if we want to take the modest approach to the matrix, we could say, well, yeah, okay, pain is produced by a set of circuits that handle different elements, modulating or enriching the nociceptive signal, and this gives rise to motivational, affective, bodily, social, personal, empathetic aspects of the experience, and they can dissociate in different ways. In other words, you can take this distributed matrix approach and say, yeah, but there are sort of, if you like, modular components to it, right? And you could say, you could treat it as, if you like, just a different, more subtle way of trying to track the same kind of phenomena that the modular theorist was interested in. Or you could take the radical approach of Jennifer Corns and some other people and say, look, what the matrix approach to pain really shows us is there is no such thing as a specialized pain processing system. Or if you're Jennifer Corns, you could say there's no such thing as pain understood as a scientifically respectable medical phenomenon. What we do have here is some initial sensory processing at the receptors. You know, no one's doubting that if I get stabbed in the arm, there's, you know, initial detection and sensory processing and transduction. But after that, the brain just configures its activity to respond in the same way that the brain is always in the business of configuring its activity to respond to stimulation and what's happening at the surface. The brain just has all these resources. It configures them adaptively to deal, okay, but to deal with the problem. But these resources are not intrinsically specialized for pain. Because if you think about it, if you go like that, well, that sensory motor movement, which can be flinching from a pain, but it can also be used in many of other contexts. The sensory motor resources are not intrinsically pain specialized. And the evaluation of pain, you know, that of a pain signal that says this is bad for me, that leads to distress, Well, that's part of emotional evaluation in general, and that's not specialized for pain. And so on. And the cognitive evaluation of pain, oh my God, I've got a headache, I've got brain cancer, who will look after the children? Am I going to, all that increases the distress and so on. That's not intrinsically specified for pain either. So the thought is the body, the system is confronted with problems, of which definitely bodily damage or threat is one, but then it configures its resources to deal adaptively. But those resources are not intrinsically pain specific. Okay. And so really what you just have is a system dealing with a surface problem. Now, naturally recurring problems produce more stable patterns, but that doesn't make the architecture intrinsically modular or intrinsically intrinsically specialized for pain. So the radical way to think of the pain matrix is that it's an amodal system, which the brain is a generally amodal system that happens to be configured to deal with a certain type of response. And really what the brain is doing is organizing its resources, the default mode network, which is about self-referential processing in a variety of contexts, the salient system, which is all about, is this relevant, how relevant, at what time scale, what resources can I use to cope with it, and so on. And an executive system, which is about high-level explicit cognitive control, and so on. Well, they're your kind of large-scale networks, if you like, and then what pain does is basically get us to configure those to deal adaptively. Okay, so within this, I'll take that framework. I say, so let's apply these ideas to try and explain pain asymbolia. What's going on in pain asymbolia, and more particularly, why is the posterior insula involved in pain asymbolia? Why does damage there or hypoactivity there produce pain asymbolia? And what is the relationship of the posterior insula to the anterior insula and the circuitry that has been implicated in or identified in kind of affective aspect of pain experience? Well, let's talk at the posterior insula first. Basically, the posterior insula, I think a good way to think of what's going on here is it's a hub. It's not a module specialized for anything in particular, but what it is a hub for basic bodily signaling. You know, when you get things happening in your body that you have to monitor, your brain has to monitor all the time, heart rate, blood pressure, etc. They get integrated to tell you the basic bodily signaling, right, that all comes and is integrated and mediated through the posterior insula. It gives you the kind of basic sensation of being a unified system. We don't regulate our body as, 100 individual separate channels. It's like we feel a certain kind of bodily selfhood that we regulate. It's part of so what's the right word? It integrates different dimensions of basic bodily salience, okay? Whereas the anterior insula, okay, it takes this kind of basic bodily integrated signal, and then relays it to other parts of the system to tell you that how to respond at longer time scales, to integrate information from memory, personal history, autobiography, social context, and so on. Okay, so that the anterior insula is, if you like, a way station or a relay station between basic bodily regulation and the higher order and more broadly and sort of cognitively mediated forms of regulation. It's more like a relay station between the salient system, sensory motor processing, and the personal autobiographical processing. It's not specialized for distress, or specialized for affect, but in virtue of playing this relay role, of course, precisely because affective states are ways of experiencing personal, social, and emotional significance. When it's active, that's what we feel. Okay, so there's a kind of basic story. Now, Colin Klein. So if we say, okay, the affective story of pain asymbolia doesn't quite cut the mustard because it depends on a sharp dissociation between affect and affective aspects of pain and sensory aspects of pain. What's the alternative? Or is there an alternative? Well, Colin Klein, he proposed an alternative, which I think is very attractive, okay? And Klein's thought was, well, yeah, but it can't just be a problem of lack of affect, because there are these other conditions where lack of affect doesn't have the same, doesn't destroy motivation or anything like that. Sometimes it increases aversive motivation. So why then do asymbolics not do anything, right? Well, here's Klein's thought. He says that it's not that the loss of affect is not driving the phenomenon, it's a feeling that the experience doesn't belong to them. They've got a version, they've got a form of depersonalization. They recognize it as a pain, but it ceased to be something worth caring about. It has the feel of a sensation they can't identify as their own. It's a kind of depersonalization syndrome in which they feel sensations they are estranged from, that they don't take to be theirs. So it's not a problem for Klein of lack of emotional feeling or lack of affective response to the pain. It's that the pain isn't belong to them, right? That's felt not to belong to them in the same way as people with depersonalization feel that their experience doesn't belong to them. And you can add, obviously enough, if something's not yours, you're not going to have an affective response to it. Okay. So as he says, and there are, it fits, or this idea fits with some reports of depersonalization experience. When a part of my body hurts, says the depersonalization patient, I feel so detached from the pain that it feels as if it was someone else's pain. Okay. And patients with depersonalization have difficulty integrating their visceral and bodily perceptions into a sense of their selves. So there's something to Klein's thought, but now comes the main part of the main interesting problem, right? The problem for the de-affectualization account is that it relies on too much of a modular story about pain processing, and also there are cases of absent affect but intact aversive response. So the de-affectualization account is not has problems. What are the problems for the depersonalization account? Well, the problem for the depersonalization account is that it's the posterior insular cortex which is involved in pain, right? Okay, and so the depersonalization account would have to explain why the posterior insular cortex would produce depersonalization for pain. Okay, but sadly, most theorists of classic depersonalization, such as Sierra and people like that, they have an affective account of depersonalization, right? Which is very congenial to the affective account of asymbolia, actually. They think that depersonalization is an affective problem of flattening down or shutting down affective responses, leaving other responses intact. So, for example, if you are being raped or tortured or traumatized, then this dissociative response is something that the brain does. The ventrolateral prefrontal cortex shuts down the anterior insular and affective responses. And as a result, you continue to experience the bodily sensations, but they're not felt to be yours. So they have an affective account of depersonalization. That's the first thing. And secondly, their affective account treats the anterior insular and those kind of anterior insular circuitry as a substrate of affect. So they buy into the modular account of affective processing. Okay, but the trouble was Klein introduced the depersonalization account as an alternative to affective accounts, right? So I mean that is a difficulty. So Klein is saying asymbolia is depersonalization. Asymbolia is depersonalization. Okay, good. And then we say, okay, well, what's the best account of depersonalization? Well, the best account of depersonalization is it's something like affective inhibition or de-affectualization. But that was the account that Klein did not like. Okay. So this is just an example of that. It's the involuntary downregulation of affect as a way to reduce the distress of trauma, leaving bodily sensation intact. So someone who's being beaten up or tortured or something, as it were, they turn off all of the kind of processing of that signal about its significance, its emotional relevance, and they just, as a result, it feels like they're floating free. Okay, and that's the thought. And just the thought is, and this is the same as in a way that opioids and ketamine do. Their first target is the anterior insular. Low doses of opioids produce a kind of depersonalization, floating free of the pain experience. And the thought is that people will say, it's not that I'm no longer in pain, it's that I'm floating away from it, I'm above it, it doesn't bother me anymore. And the target there is the anterior insular cortex, low-dose opioids, okay? All right, so how to resolve, and this is the real meat and potatoes of the talk, I guess. it comes quickly now. How to resolve these issues? All right. Well, the basic thought is the brain needs to treat a very complicated system, which we have, as a unified, simple entity, a me, a self, because the interactions that are involved in regulating your body and system are too complex and too nonlinear to manage one by one. So, do you think you have blood oxygenation, acidification, heartbeat, metabolism? You don't adjust, the brain can't adjust all those little levers one by one. Rather, it's like integrates them all and represents the system as a single symbol, as a single simple thing. All these signals are combined in one unified entity, which gives rise to the feeling of being a single simple self, right? So, which gives rise to, as Seth said, the representation of the body with the internal physiological milieu providing a primary reference, a material me. Okay, and here's my way of putting this, right? If you think of, notice this high-tech slide that I drew this morning. Thought is, think of something like a heart rate and blood pressure, two individual variables, right? Well, you could represent those as variables on two dimensions, which would create a kind of space. So if you want to move in that space, if you have, say, for example, on the left, high heart rate, high blood pressure, so you're agitated, aroused, but you want to move to the bottom left point of calm and tranquility, lower your blood pressure, lower your heart rate, calm down and everything. Well, obviously you're trying to move, as we might say, in this two-dimensional space. Okay, and what you'll be trying to do is kind of get from the point of the top right to the top left. So you'll be trying to follow the trajectory of the dotted line. And in fact, that is what we do as we go through the world. We try and change the quality of our, as it were, bodily space. We try and feel better. We try and put ourselves in the situation in bodily space which is adaptive for the context. If you're playing sport or in boxing, it's good to have a heart rate up and blood pressure up. But if you're sitting at home on the couch, patting the dog, watching the movie, no. So you're always trying to regulate yourself. And one way to think of this regulation is as moving in what you would call interoceptive state space, trying to change the feeling that you have of material me or bodily me to put it in the adaptive situation. And as I just point out there, the point of this diagram is, you see the lines or the blue lines. The regulation is not always automatically successful. You don't always move instantly and automatically from agitation to tranquility, or from tranquility to arousal adaptively. You're trying to follow the kind of optimal path, but there is this slight, you overcorrect, you undercorrect. Okay. And what we can call active inference, or what active inference serves to self-representation say is, self-awareness should be thought of as basically trying to reduce this space of error. What you go through life, your brain, and trying to put yourself in the optimal situation, the optimal space, okay, always by trying to reduce this space of error. And we never quite get there, but as we do that, what we do in order to do that, we have to predict where we want to be, how we're going relative to where we want to be, and so on. And so the experience of being, if you like, an embodied self is the experience of trying to reduce this space and the experience of the discrepancy between where we are and where we want to be. And the brain infers that the self is the thing which moves through this state space. The diagram on the right, I've just added, just put another line there because, of course, there are many, many homeostatic variables. As I say, it's not just heart rate and blood pressure, oxygenation, acidification, metabolism, the number of variables which are relative to how you're feeling at any moment is a lot. But this is precisely why we can't sense them all individually. You just feel a certain way, right? When you feel tired, right, then you go to sleep. You don't try and change your adenosine levels. You don't try and change the metabolism in your cells. You can't do it. All you can do is get, if you like, the overall readout. Where am I in homeostatic state space? Tired. So I'll have a cup of coffee, or I'll go to sleep and wake up feeling refreshed. In another part of homeostatic state space, and I am the thing which moves. I am the thing which regulates, right? In that case. In that respect, we are like flying our bodies like or controlling our bodies like a pilot flies a plane in a Boeing 380. They have no access to the electronics, to the mechanics, to all the things that make the plane move. All they do is move a little icon around on a screen, right? They move the icon left, right, they bank it, and the plane responds. Well, that's like us. We can't change our metabolism directly. We can't change anything directly. All we can do is go to sleep, wake up, have a drink, talk to our friends, do all these things that change the quality of our experience, but we can't change all the lower level things directly. How is this relevant? And so what I would say is the self here is an interoceptive center of gravity, if you like. You know, it moves in the space of interoceptive sensation. Dennett thought the self was a narrative center of gravity. That, in other words, remember Daniel Dennett thought, because we always use the word I, we talk about I, we narrate our experiences and communicate them, it makes us feel like a self, according to Dennett, right? But I think that's not the right way to think of it. He thinks language makes us infer a real persisting entity when in fact there's nothing but a set of interacting cognitive and biological processes underneath. But in fact, the inference that we are a persisting thing arises at a much lower level because we can't be a kind of disintegrated, disunified set of bodily regulatory processes. We have to feel like a single thing in order to regulate them because we have no access to them. Think about a case like if you're undergoing chemotherapy, you feel terrible. Not in a particular place or location, you feel terrible overall. But almost every cell in your body, every cognitive process, every metabolic process has been changed. All you can do is try and kind of rest and take your medicine. And hopefully you'll feel better as a result. Okay. And so the thought here is that the self is the thing which the mind postulates, which it can, whose prospects it can change and affect, you know, by running away from things, by medicating, by resting, etc., etc. And this is why someone like, and so this sort of basic bodily regulation, of course, where I'm going with this, is that the hub, the integrative hub for it is the posterior insular cortex, right? All these kind of basic bodily signals converge here, right? You know, metabolism, heart rate, and of course, pain signaling, bodily damage, inflammatory response, all these things are rooted through here so that they enable us to feel like a bodily self, okay? The anterior insula takes that basic bodily signal of material me, if you like, as Seth called it so nicely, and connects it up with other longer term, higher order, more cognitively sophisticated and abstract sort of things to kind of, if you like, emotionally process that signal. Tell you, okay, material me is in this state, material me is optimal or out of optimal range. What does that mean, right? It can mean a lot of different things. And those different things require different responses according to the context. But first you have to determine the context and the significance, but the bodily systems can't do it. Think of this, right? If you're in the gym doing sit-ups, you might get a kind of sharp cramp in your abdominal muscles because you're working hard, but that's not really going to bother you. It's entirely a predictable thing, and you'll feel it as a kind of transient abdominal pain. But if you're worried about having a miscarriage and and you're a long way from hospital or something like that, then the same kind of bodily cramp will be felt completely differently. It'll be fraught with a whole lot of emotional and social and personal resonance, and it'll be distressing and so on. So it won't be distressing in the gym, but the same bodily signal can be felt as incredibly distressing in other situations. And that's because of the way it is evaluated and integrated in the kind of overall social, emotional, personal context. And it's the role of the anterior insula to take that basic bodily signal, if you like, and integrate it, join it up with all of the other cognitive, emotional, and so on processing to enable it to be evaluated. And when it is evaluated, that's why the bodily signals can be felt as affectively salient. And of course, it goes both ways. You know, you can... people who are highly anxious, ruminative, thinking about the terrible consequences and the possible bad outcomes, they can feel quite innocuous bodily signals or even absent bodily signals as intensely distressing, which is just It's a way of thinking about the roles of the posterior insula and the anterior insula in the overall amodal matrix of the mind. So what I would say is, I would put it this way, is that the posterior insula basically collects all the bodily signals, integrates them into into a unity so that you feel like an integrated thing, and then they get transcribed, as it were. You know, their emotional significance is determined and contextualized and put in an overall self narrative, if you like, or the story, and that's how you feel them as affective states. And that's the role of the anterior insula, is precisely in that transcription. But what I want to emphasize, that doesn't mean the anterior insula is a substrate of affect. The anterior insula is if you like, a link, a relay station between interoception and all the other cognitive processing that's required to establish the significance of interoception. Okay, so what does this tell us? Well, I think the conclusion falls out pretty easily now. Pain asymbolia is associated with damage to the posterior insular cortex. Why? Because the posterior insular cortex is a convergent zone where all of the basic bodily signaling and so on is integrated as belonging to the kind of single unified thing, material me, the basic bodily self, as Seth called it. And if due to damage in the posterior insula, which seems to be the consensus, the nociceptive signal is not being integrated and incorporated, right? There's still a nociceptive signal going on, but it's no longer integrated, unified as part of the kind of unified system. So that nociceptive signal isn't incorporated in the kind of the processing system at the basic level. So it is processed, as I would say, outside the self model, or outside the self-representational system. It's still happening. You know, the person with pain asymbolia still feels bodily damage, but because the bodily damage signal is not integrated with all the other signals and put together to be felt as part of a kind of unity, that is then, that unity serves as a basis for regulation, the pain signal is not, it's not felt to belong to me. So that's why, as Klein says, asymbolia is quite right. It's a kind of indifference to the signal. One's body becomes, as it were, just another object in the world. And this is just the thought that for things to be felt, you know, vitally and existentially relevant to us, right, they have to be integrated at a kind of very basic level for systemic regulation. But the pain signal, it's felt as a signal, but it's not felt as a signal that needs to be regulated, responded to, and integrated with all of the other processing, you know, that's relevant to determining my prospects in the world and moving me through bodily and affective space adaptively. Rather, I continue on with my life, living my life, feeling my body, going about my business, and then there's this other bodily thing which is happening, but it's not really relevant anymore, like a scratch or something like that. Whereas depersonalization, I do buy into the dissociative response to trauma, but not necessarily into the affective modularization story. The bodily self is intact in depersonalization. All the signals are being processed and integrated and coming through the posterior insula. So there is a basic sense of bodily self and bodily integrity intact. And also higher level cognitive processing and narration are intact. So the patient can narrate their experience and say what's happening to them. But because the anterior insula has been shut down, the signals are not being evaluated for their kind of, the signals are not being transcribed. They're not being evaluated for their social and emotional significance. So the patient, as it were, feels my body is in this state, you know, nociceptive signaling or interoceptive signaling are happening to me, but the anterior insula is not taking that signal and saying, how is it emotionally relevant? What goals are being met or frustrated? What are other people going to think? What shall I do? What shall I do in the future? All of these cognitive systems are not being brought online to deal with it and contextualize the signal. So it just sits there, as it were, inertly. Okay, and I think I'm just on time, I hope. So the overall story, that's the story of pain asymbolia, but I think there are general lessons there for the understanding of the relationship between suffering and pain and self-awareness. And that is that, you know, self-awareness has a kind of, if you like, a hierarchy from basic bodily to conceptual and narrative. And it is the result of emergent processing across distributed matrix of systems, which are not in themselves specialized for much. Right? There is no pain processing system necessarily. And there are not many, and there are not really so-called emotional processing systems either. The basic emotions theory doesn't really stand up or cut the mustard. But what you do have is adaptive patterns of configuration of this distributed matrix. And the result is kind of emergent experiences. And when we try and understand those, we can look at, if you like, hubs or the differential contribution of different systems to those processes. Okay, I'll stop there, I think. I'm sorry, I'm a bit over time, but there you have it.
Thank you very much, Philip Gerrans. So now we're gonna have time for questions. If you would like to ask a question, you can either virtually raise your hand with a tool in Zoom in reactions at the bottom, or write in the chat that you have a question. And if you'd like to unshare your screen, maybe we could see everyone